Hello, welcome back to the A4Q Testing Summit edition 2024. I have the absolute privilege of hosting this session with RIOU du COSQUER, who I have to say I've known for very many years, and I always enjoy listening to him present. Eric is going to talk about measuring the efficiency of test activities and measuring the cost, which is a highly topical and a question often asked, I know. Very quickly before we press ahead, if you have questions, please put them into the comments. I know Eric would like to be able to answer those questions and give you a little bit more of his insight into the things that really do matter to you. And also just have a little think as you're watching, concentrate hard, because we're going to have a competition, a vote for the best presentation of the summit, just to bring some fun to the whole event, as if there could be any more fun. So Eric, I'm going to pass over to you now, and sit back everyone and enjoy.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you very much, Debbie, for this introduction, and thank you very much to A4Q for organizing this testing summit. I'm very happy to participate today. So today I'll be talking about a very important topic, which is the measurement of the efficiency of the test activities on any project. Are we able to measure this efficiency, or are we just measuring the cost of the test activities? To briefly introduce myself, RIOU du COSQUER, I can just tell you that I fully work in the field of software testing and software quality for about 20 years. I work in various topics such as business analysis, supported by IQBBA. I also work a lot in the field of requirements engineering, software testing, of course, and I'm also able to carry out official TMMi assessment and audits because I have the status of TMMi accredited lead assessor. And I work for a company called Certilog, providing services in the field of software testing and information system quality. So today we're going to raise a couple of questions. Some of them might look a little bit obvious or stupid. Let's have a look at that. Firstly, is it necessary to test? The second question we're going to address is how to measure the cost of testing. The third one will be how to measure the efficiency of your test activities. And finally, why TMMi and how to use TMMi. So the first question that might sound a little bit stupid is it necessary to test? If you're listening to my presentation, I'm fully sure that it's obvious for you that it's absolutely mandatory to test, but I'm also sure that from time to time, you met or you're going to meet people who are unfortunately not convinced that it's necessary to test. I remember a few months ago on a project, I met a project manager and I wanted to introduce test activities on the project, and the project manager told me, "Oh, Eric, the only test we need is the one carried out by the end users after the product has gone live." And I can tell you that after the first release, it was a real disaster, and the project manager changed her mind and she agreed to put some money in the test activities. So I think we all need to be patient and to keep explaining that software testing is very important. And sometimes I'm still using some very basic comparison and examples, such as asking, would you board on a plane knowing it has never been tested? Of course, the answer is no, and sometimes it supports the implementation of the test activities. Another good reason to introduce testing is to remind your colleagues that failures, and particularly failures in production, might be very expensive. So it's really worth spending money in the field of testing. I can give you a couple of figures. The first one is about the e-commerce website. And if you consider the most important, the large e-commerce website, the cost per minute of downtime is around 5,600 euros or dollars, which are more or less the same. If you consider a very large company with a large information system, a company with more than 20,000 employees, and there are many large companies like this in Europe, in France, and everywhere in the world, the cost per minute of IT downtime is around $25,000. So it's really used. It's really huge. I'm not saying that if you test correctly, you will never have such failures, but I'm fully convinced that testing will highly limit the risk of having failures in production. So once you have agreed that testing is very important, that you need to implement test activities, once you have implemented test activities on your project, you will have to measure the cost of these test activities. It's not possible to measure the efficiency of the test activities without measuring the cost of the test activities. When I start talking about this, again, sometimes I'm asked, okay, but what do you mean by test activities? Is it just only executing tests, trying to use the software to find bugs? Of course not. Testing is much more than just executing the test cases. Testing is a set of multiple activities to be organized at various test levels. It will start from test planning, which is more or less like project management dedicated to testing. That's very, very important. You need someone to coordinate the test activities. And at the very end of the test activities, you can also find what we call test completion, which is like taking time at the end of the project to consider what went well, what went wrong, what can you improve to make the test more efficient. And in between, you have a couple of other activities such as test monitoring and control to follow up the progress of the test activities and to measure the quality of the tested product. You also have test analysis, design, test implementation, where you find test automation, and also the test execution. So having in mind these activities can be a good way to support the estimation of the cost, because you can think about a work breakdown structure and to allocate time and money to each test activity. However, even if it's very important to measure the cost of the test activities, it's not that easy. And today, I'm not going to give you a magic formula to measure the cost of the test activities. I'm just going to share with you a couple of examples of organization where it's more or less difficult to estimate the cost of testing. Let's start with an easy one. Let's imagine you have one single project with full-time testers. In that case, estimated the cost of testing will be relatively easy because basically it's going to be the daily cost of the testers plus the cost of the testing tools, if any. So it's relatively easy. Unfortunately, this situation where you have full-time testers is less and less common because today, as you know, we are many working in Agile where the same person can have different roles in the same project. And it's more and more rare to have full-time testers. So this case one is easy to measure the cost, but not that often. Let's have a look at a second example. This one is about a large company where you have a test center supporting multiple projects with their test activities. In this situation, which is still valid and in place in many large companies, for example, BNP Paribas in France, or AXA, or other companies like this, it's relatively easy to assess the cost of testing because the test center manager will know how much the test center costs, and you will just have to add the cost of the test activities supported by the project. What I mean is that the test center will be in charge of some of the test activities for the project, but you will always have other test activities located in the project, inside the project team. For example, if you consider the test to be carried out at the component level, you often need some software development skills. So these activities, unit testing, component testing, and test automation at the low level will be managed by the project itself. But at the end, it's not that difficult. Cost of the test center plus the cost of the activities still supported by the project. Let's have a look at a third example where you can feel the need to estimate the cost of testing when you work in Scrum. So I would say that in Scrum, it's a bit more tricky because you will have part-time testers in the project. Someone may be involved in the test activities at a high level, but not at a low level. So it's a bit more tricky. Of course, we can consider that in Scrum, in Agile, when we estimate the user stories one by one with story points, we have to take into account the cost of the test activities, but it's not very accurate. In Scrum, again, if you consider the test planning, like test project management, well, it will be partly covered by what we do during the release and sprint planning, but again, it's not very easy to measure that very accurately. Another comparison in Agile, what we call the test completion is part of the retrospective, but the retrospective at the end of a sprint will not be fully dedicated to testing. So testing will just be part of it. And apart from these activities occurring during the sprint inside the team, we may also have to consider test activities carried out outside the Scrum team and possibly outside the sprint. So what I'm saying is that in Scrum, it's not that easy to estimate how much money and how much time you allocate to testing. Not easy, but still very important. So we need to try to find a way to assess this cost. Let's consider a fourth model, a fourth example of another way of organizing the test activities and the software development in a company. This one is called the Spotify model from the company with the same name. With this model, I think it's a bit less difficult to estimate the cost of testing. In this model, you may have multiple teams called squad, which are relatively close to a Scrum team. But with this model, we consider that software testing and software quality is so important that we need someone in each team dedicated to the test activities. So in this organization, to calculate the cost of testing, you have to consider the daily cost of the QAs or testers in the teams. You also have to consider the cost of the testing guild. The guild is like a transversal team in charge of supporting the squads with the testing practices, the tools, the methodology. So this cost also has to be taken into account. And then, of course, you have to add the cost of the testing tools, if any, and you have to add the cost of external teams supporting some very specific testing topics, such as performance testing or security testing. So that's about it for Spotify. A few words about SAFE, the Scaled Agile Framework. In this model, again, when you have a look at it for the first time, it's not that obvious to understand that testing is part of it. So when you work in SAFE and when you want to assess the cost of testing, you need to have a deep look in the teams to identify where test activities are carried out. And to elaborate on this, I took this picture from the TMAP method from Sogeti because I think it's very clear. What can you see on this picture? You can see that on SAFE, if you consider one specific trend, you will have multiple teams and you can identify one or a couple of testing experts inside each team. So this is the first cost for the team, for this model. And in addition to this, in SAFE, a very, very efficient practice is to have what we call a system team, which is a team of multiple people from various areas with different skills. This system team will be in charge of supporting the other teams with different activities, including testing. So to assess the cost of testing, you need to add a percentage of the cost of the system team to the overall cost of testing in SAFE. So that's about it for this example. I just wanted to let you feel that estimating the cost of testing is not easy, but it's feasible, and it really depends on the context of the organization. Let's come to the question how to measure the efficiency of your test activities. As a TMMi Lead Assessor, I often meet people in charge of quality or in charge of testing in a large company. They are managing a team of 20, 50, 100 people. They know how much it's cost. But when I raise this question, what about the efficiency of your test activities? I often don't have any answer. And it's really surprising because it should be so obvious that it's mandatory to be able to justify why we spend so much money in testing. But again, it's not that easy. So let's have a look at this question. I would say that it's always the same story, the story about cost, quality, and delay. Not only, there are other topics. So for me, estimating, measuring the efficiency of the test activities will be like defining and measuring metrics related to these three factors. And what I'm going to do in this presentation is that I'm going to share with you a couple of examples, 7 examples of metrics that can be used to support the measurements of the efficiency of your test activities. The first one, which is a very common one when you start thinking about measuring this efficiency, is measuring the number and percentage of critical failures occurred in production that could have been avoided with a better testing. So this is a very, very powerful indicator, very, very useful one. This one will be based on 2 success factors. I would say the first one is called RCA, standing for root cause analysis. And the second one is based on the possibility to organize meetings with various stakeholders. Basically, once a product or a service has been released, after a few weeks or a few months, you will have to sit around the table with various stakeholders from the business side, from the customer side, from the technical side, and you will have to consider the failures one by one and to analyze and to identify the causes of this failure. And if you all agree to admit that a cause of a specific failure is due to a lack of testing or bad practices in testing, you will take this failure into account. So this is the first one. Example 2 is the following. It's about measuring the average criticity of the defects detected during the first day or first week of test execution. And this one will be relying on risk-based testing. Why is it so important? What do we want to see with this one? The goal of this indicator is to ensure that the most critical defects will be detected first. And if you implement the risk-based testing, you will focus the first test executions on the most risky areas in your software. So that's really a good way to ensure that you are able to first identify the most critical defects. The third example I would like to share with you is a little bit different. This one is the number of defects detected in the main input for testing, like specification, requirements, user stories, before, and that's very important, before the design and implementation begin, and also to measure the detection cost per defect. So this one will be using reviews, and I think it's very easy to understand. The goal is to anticipate as much as possible the discovery of defects. Using reviews is very, very efficient because you will be working on work product to be reviewed early in the software development lifecycle. So it will be relatively easy to detect defects. It's not going to be expensive. And these defects, if they had not been detected during the reviews, could be very, very critical a few months or years later if they become failures in production. So this indicator is also very important to show that you are able to anticipate, you are able to implement what we call the early testing principle. The fourth example I'm going to share with you is also covering the early testing principle. This one is about measuring the average time elapsed between the introduction of a defect and its detection. If you detect a defect shortly after it was introduced, the cost of fixing it will be very low. On the contrary, if a defect introduced at the beginning of the project is detected much later, at the end of the project or even in production, the cost of correction will be much higher. So this is another good way to measure the efficiency of your test activities. The fifth example I would like to give you is, well, might be a little bit more difficult to be measured. It's the progress of the average cost of testing per project or release, measured in percentage, with the same quality level in production. So this one is very important to measure the improvement of your test activities. So let's imagine that before starting the improvement of your test activities, you consider that the average cost of testing per project is 30%. So you can calculate this on multiple projects. After 1 year of improvement efforts, you calculate again and you reach 25%. It means that you have improved the efficiency of your test activities. Of course, only if the quality level in production at the end is the same. If you lower the cost of testing and lower the quality at the same time, it's not a good practice. Another one, it's about measuring the average percentage of false positives and false negatives after test execution. I guess you know what false positive, false negatives are. A false positive is when you have a defect that should not be there because the test result should be passed and it was said to be failed. The false negative is when you don't have a defect, the test execution was said to be successful, but you should have a defect. So this is a very, very useful indicator to check that the testing team is working correctly with the proper tools and is able to detect real defects. And this one is also related to the quality of the test data and test environment, and also to the testing skills of the team members. Let's have a look at the last example I wanted to share with you, example 7. This one is, well, this one might be a little bit surprising for you. It's the average duration spent by a tester in a company before he or she leaves. So this one is really based on my experience with the certification of companies with TMMi. I don't know if it's the case everywhere, but in France, what I can tell you is that we suffer of a lack of good testers, a lack of people with good testing skill, particularly in the field of test automation. So for a company, it's very difficult to identify people and to have new employees joining the company. What we clearly see with the TMMi certified organization is that when you have a certified company or a certified testing center, people will be very happy to join your team because they know that they will be learning, they will be improving their skills. And once they are in the team, in the TMMi certified team, they will stay longer. And for me, this is another way of measuring the efficiency of your test organization, because if you are able to get new employees and to make them stay longer, you will save a lot of money and you will again improve the efficiency of your team. So this is my transition to TMMi, and it's going to be the last part of my presentation. A few words about TMMi. I would love to have 3 days to speak about TMMi, but just a few words today. If you don't already know what TMMi is, I would just summarize like this. TMMi is a repository of good test-specific practices. And these good practices are distributed on 5 levels. And they are split between a couple of process areas that are main topics dedicated to testing. So just remember that TMMi is like a repository with multiple good practices dedicated to testing. And TMMi can be used as a tool to assess the efficiency of your test organization. How does it work? Well, it's very easy. It works like an audit. You first have to define the scope of the entity to be assessed. Then you have to identify, together with the TMMi assessors, a couple of people to be interviewed to address the various topics of TMMi. Then the interviews will be carried out. The practices will be scored. Is these good practices in place? Yes, no, partially, fully, and so on. And with TMMi, it will be easy to generate an improvement plan with very specific actions. And once the improvement action plan is implemented, if you wish to, if there is a value for the test center or for the company, it's possible to carry out a formal assessment in order to get the official formal TMMi certification. Just a couple of examples of the deliverables you can get from the TMMi assessment. You can get an overview on the efficiency of your team regarding to various process areas. For example, in this picture at the top, you can see that as far as the test environments are concerned, we consider that the practices in place are very, very good. You have a large percentage of green. It means that most of the good practices from TMMi are already in place. So this is the overview. And then with TMMi, area per area, you have a more detailed synthesis with strengths and improvement areas on this topic. If you want to go into the detail, you also have a scoring of all the practices. So it's very easy to get the list of the practices that are not in place in your team, but that could be really useful for you. You may be wondering why I'm talking about TMMi during this presentation about measuring the efficiency of the test activities. Well, the reason is very simple. It's just because inside TMMi, you really have the best practices that will be supporting the measurement of the efficiency of the test activities. Let me give you a couple of examples. If you consider TMMi level 2, which is actually the lowest level of TMMi because level 1 doesn't really exist. So from the very beginning, while using TMMi, you will have to deal with test performance indicators. I mentioned a couple of indicators in this presentation. If you have a look in the TMMi model, you will get advice explanation and more examples of test performance indicators. You already have content in the TMMi model. If we stay at level 2, we have a look at TMMi again, level 2. You will see at level 2 that risk-based testing is not an option. TMMi consider that it's so important to assess, to identify, and to manage the risk on a project that it has to be there from level 2. So risk-based testing is really part of TMMi, and you don't have the choice but to implement risk-based testing. You may be thinking that it's a bit demanding. Yes, it's maybe, but honestly, it's very, very efficient, and it's really the best way to identify the most critical defects first in your test execution process. Another example, in the first part of my presentation, I spoke about how to assess the cost of testing. In TMMi, you have a specific goal dedicated to estimation of the test effort with, again, method, good advice, and examples. So that's really very useful. I spoke about the early detection of defect with reviews. In TMMi, you have a very practical way of implementing the reviews, like identifying the work products to be reviewed. It's also about measuring the efficiency of the reviews. How much time does it take? How many defects do you detect? And so on. So it's a really good support to implement the review process. And a last example is the root cause analysis. So this one is related to the first indicator I give as an example to consider the failures in production and to understand why you had this failure. So the root cause analysis is part of the TMMi model and will be really supporting you with the analysis of the failures detected in production. So that's about for my short presentation today. What to remember? Firstly, testing is a must. We don't have the choice but to test. And unfortunately, it's part of our daily activities. From time to time, we need to struggle a little bit to make people understand that testing is really very important. Second point, measuring the cost of testing is not easy, but very important, particularly if you are thinking about measuring the efficiency of the test activities. Third point, implementing test performance indicators is very, very important. It's really a good way to ensure that the money you are spending in the test activities is worth, it's useful. You can justify that it's very important. You are able to demonstrate that the test activities are efficient. And the fourth point is just to let you know that TMMi is a model that will support you to measure and increase the efficiency of your test activities. So that's about it for me for today. Thank you very much for your participation in this online event. And if you have any questions, I think I have a couple of minutes to answer them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. Absolutely packed with information there. You went through several examples, so lots of different ways to measure. Which would be your preferred way usually? What's your preferred method of the examples you went through? Which is the one that you would normally personally think, yeah, that's my go-to?
I would say that the first one is my favorite because you're asking someone how much money he spent in testing, and then you continue, you ask, yeah, are you sure this money is worth? How do you measure the efficiency of this test activity? So the first one would be definitely my favorite one.
And for people to become more familiar with some of the examples that you gave, can you recommend how they can familiarize themselves a little bit more with the types of approaches?
Well, I would say that again, TMMi is a very good source to consider other examples of indicators and metrics for for measuring the efficiency of testing. So I would recommend to have a look in the TMMi model, which is available on the TMMi website, tmmi.org.
I know we've got a question about TMMi. I'm just looking here in the comments. Can we pop the questions up now? Yeah, you spoke about TMMi. This is a big question, actually. Can you give a quick overview of how it can be used? I think you touched on.
Yes, sure. I think there are different options. So the very easy way to use TMMi is just to download the model from the tmmi.org website. You can have a look at it, and it's going to be like a toolbox with many good practices. It's already very, very efficient, but the issue is that you might be using TMMi in a way which is not the perfect or the correct way. So in order to be sure that you are using TMMi correctly, I could recommend to study a little bit and to take the TMMi professional exam with or without a training beforehand, because it's a way to ensure that you will be using the TMMi model properly and it's going to be more efficient.
Is there a particular sector where TMMi is best suited, Eric?
Yeah, that's a good question. When I started using TMMi, I thought that the first companies interested by TMMi should be or would be the IT services company, because they want to make their services more profitable, they want to get more customers. But actually, when I started, and it's also what you can see on the TMMi website, there are many companies from the financial industry, bank and finance, willing to improve their practices. So a large number of such companies are certified. And we also have large companies from the industry, airline or automotive industry. So it's not only for IT services companies.
And what's the main kind of push-pull associated with TMMi for these organizations, where the main benefit is?
Oh, well, that's a good question. And by the way, the TMMi Foundation has recently published a survey, which is called, if I remember well, TMMi in the financial industry. So we have such a question: why do you use TMMi? What are the main benefits? And a couple of answers come often. It's like increasing the efficiency of the test activities, measuring the cost of testing.
Yes.
So that's and also another answer is just being TMMi certified, to have something official, an independent certification to publish, to share with the customers or partners.
I think we've got another question here. I'm just kind of trying to keep an eye on stuff here. Oh, I've heard this one before, but it comes up again and again. Is TMMi applicable in an agile environment?
Yeah, so that's a very, very interesting one. Again, when I started with TMMi, I was mainly using TMMi on companies with a traditional approach, with a V cycle. And then I had to deal with agile project more and more. And I saw that, well, it was also working in agile perfectly. We will not be using the same terminology. For example, instead of talking about requirements, we'll be dealing with user stories. We'll not be using the same tools, the same method, but it's really applicable as it is in the agile environment. And regarding this, the TMMi Foundation has created a document explaining how to use TMMi in the agile environment. So it's very, very powerful. And TMMi is really not something making the documentation mandatory, making practices mandatory. It's really based on the efficiency of the practices. So if a practice from TMMi is not useful in an agile environment, it will not be mandatory. And I had the pleasure to certify 2 companies fully working in SAFe at TMMi level 3. And it was really very interesting because they managed to implement the TMMi practices with a specific way in their context, using, for example, the definition of ready, definition of done instead of entry-exit criteria. They also had the iteration planning with various checklists mentioning the importance of testing. So it was really interesting, and it works perfectly. Yeah.
Wonderful. I can't see any more questions at the moment, Eric, but I know that if there are, please, everybody, just pop them into the comments and we'll refer them back to Eric, or Eric can be contacted through LinkedIn, I know. We're kind of at the top of the hour now. We have to move on. Thank you, Eric. As always, lots of really helpful information. We'll share the presentation, and of course the recording will be available so people can dip in and out, because a lot of good information there and useful examples. So thank you again.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Goodbye. Thank you.